When I saw my husband holding the small black box, my breath caught, not because of what was inside, but because of where he said he found it. "It was under the seat in my car," he said casually, placing it in my hands, smiling like he'd brought home flowers. I opened it slowly, already knowing. The bracelet lay nestled in velvet, the exact one I thought I had hidden. The one I never meant for him to see. My fingers trembled as I traced the familiar curve of its silver clasp. I looked at him, smiling, unknowing, and all I could think was, does he really not remember giving it to me? No. Because he didn't. It wasn't from him. It was from someone else. Someone who should never have bought it. Someone who should never have looked at me that way. My stepson. And now I was staring at the evidence, handed to me by my own husband, as if it were nothing. I clutched the box tighter, trying to keep my hand steady, pretending to admire the gift. My heart pounded so loudly it filled the room. My husband turned back to his laptop, sipping his tea, as if the world hadn't just shifted. He had no idea. Not yet. But I knew this moment would come back. It always does. It always does. And before I tell you what really happened, all of it, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Have you ever had a secret you buried so deep, only for it to claw its way back to the surface when you least expected it? It was spring when we married. Not the kind of spring you see in movies, all soft breezes and pastel skies, but a reluctant one, the kind that comes after a long winter and still carries its shadow. That felt appropriate. I was entering his life as someone new, but everything about his world still belonged to her. She had been gone for almost 2 years when he proposed. Her perfume still lingered on some of his coats. I pretended not to notice. I was good at pretending. The house wasn't mine. Not truly. Her paintings hung in the hallway, her handwriting was still etched on the calendar in the kitchen, faded but visible, David's recital, Doctor, 4 p.m., buy tulips. I never erased them. He never asked me to. David was her son, not mine. My stepson, technically, but I never used the word aloud. He had his own apartment across town, though he visited often, dutifully, politely, like clockwork. We rarely spoke beyond pleasantries. I thought it was better that way. Clean boundaries. At first, everything felt like a role I had agreed to play. The young wife. The bridge between silence and warmth. I arranged the flowers, kept the house quiet, and left his coffee exactly the way he liked it, dark, with 1 sugar cube and nothing else. He was kind. Always had been. But his kindness was mechanical, like a well-oiled machine that had forgotten it was built to feel. He worked long hours, sometimes weekends, but never with cruelty. Just distance. He never hurt me. He just didn't see me. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the tick of the clock in our bedroom and wonder how many women before me had felt this same emptiness. Not pain. Not sadness. Just vacancy. Like walking through a home that doesn't echo your name. I didn't marry for passion. I married because I believed I could build something steady. Something whole. Maybe even something healing. But healing is never quiet. It thrashes. And nothing was moving here. Not me. Not him. Not even time. David's visits became less frequent over that first year. He always brought something, a bottle of wine, books for his father, or pastries he knew I liked but never admitted. I thought it was sweet. Harmless. I told myself that more times than I can count. One Sunday, he arrived earlier than usual. His hair was longer. He looked tired. I asked if he was all right, and he gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just busy, he said. Then he disappeared into his father's study and stayed there most of the day. I remember that afternoon vividly. It had rained, just a light mist tapping the windows. I stood in the kitchen, wiping down already clean counters, just to do something. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, older than I remembered, somehow softer around the edges. I touched the side of my face, wondering when I had stopped recognizing it. Later, David came into the kitchen for tea. He moved quietly, like someone trying not to wake ghosts. We stood in silence as the kettle boiled. His eyes flicked to my hands, then back to the floor. Something had shifted. Not suddenly. Gradually. Like a line we hadn't meant to draw, blurring at the edges. He asked how I was. Not in that casual, offhand way, but like he actually wanted to know. I hesitated. Then said something about the weather. He nodded. Our hands brushed as I passed him a mug, and I felt something electric jolt through me. Silly, I thought. Stupid. But my hand stayed on the mug longer than it needed to. When he left that evening, he didn't say goodbye to me. Not with words. Just a glance, short, unreadable, and then he was gone. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself many things that week. The following days were uneventful. My husband was away on business, as usual. I spent my evenings reading, folding laundry, watering plants. Everything ordinary. Everything expected. And then the package arrived. A small black box, no return address. I opened it with curiosity, thinking perhaps it was something I ordered and forgot about. But the moment I saw the bracelet, slim, silver, with a small engraving on the inside, I knew. It wasn't random. It was intentional. Deliberate. The engraving read, "For what you never say." I stared at it for a long time. The room around me dimmed, like the air itself was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to hide it. My second, to pretend it wasn't from who I feared it was. I placed it in my drawer beneath scarves I never wore and closed it softly. As if even the wood might judge me. That night, I dreamed of nothing. Not silence. Not storms. Just absence. But the morning after, that was when everything began to unravel. It started with the smallest detail, my husband, coming home early. A rare thing. He walked into the kitchen holding the exact same black box I had hidden the night before. My throat closed. My legs went cold. He smiled. Found this in the car. Thought it was yours. And just like that, the air shifted. The rules changed. And the truth, the one I had buried beneath reason and restraint, began to claw its way up. The bracelet felt heavier on my wrist than it should have. Maybe it was guilt. Or memory. Or the fact that the man who handed it to me, with such casual affection, was not the one who had chosen it. I wore it for the rest of the day, unsure why. Maybe to punish myself. Maybe to prove I could keep control. The metal felt cool against my skin, like a secret pressed into flesh. That evening, David arrived unannounced. I heard his car before I saw it, the familiar hum of the engine drifting in through the open kitchen window. My husband was upstairs on a work call, pacing in his office. I stood frozen, fingers curled around a dish towel, not sure what to do. It was the first time I'd seen David since the bracelet had arrived. Since I'd kissed him. He stepped inside without knocking, a habit he never used to have. I turned toward the doorway just as he entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, like a wall. His eyes dropped to my wrist. Just for a second. Just long enough. I see he gave it to you, he said, voice quiet. I wanted to deny it. To say I didn't know what he meant. But the words wouldn't come. I just nodded, barely. He looked away, jaw tight, and then moved past me, heading toward the back patio like he needed air. I followed a few steps behind, unsure what I thought I was doing. The light was fading, the sky turning lavender and gold. Everything looked soft, but the tension between us was sharp enough to cut. Outside, the wind caught his hair. He stood with his back to me, staring at the trees swaying beyond the garden. I leaned against the doorframe, not wanting to step any closer. "This is wrong," I said finally. He turned to face me. His expression wasn't angry, just tired. Like someone fighting sleep for days. "I know," he said. "It doesn't change anything." His honesty shook me more than if he'd tried to defend it. I wanted to go back. To the moment before the first glance lasted too long. Before the air between us changed. Before the line blurred. But you can't undo a feeling. You can only pretend it didn't happen. And pretending has a way of breaking you slowly. After a few minutes of silence, he walked back inside without another word. I stayed outside, staring at the path he had just taken, as if it might give me an answer. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, and my husband lay beside me, breathing steadily, unaware of the storm running wild behind my ribs. I kept staring at the ceiling, imagining what might have happened if I had said something different, done something better. But nothing felt clear anymore. The next day was unremarkable, on the surface. My husband worked from home, taking calls and tapping on his keyboard. I cooked breakfast, then lunch. We spoke in passing, about bills, appointments, errands. Everything normal. Everything rehearsed. But my thoughts drifted back to David. I hadn't seen him since that evening. He hadn't texted, hadn't called. Part of me felt relieved. The other part felt something worse, disappointed. In the afternoon, I sat by the window with a book I wasn't reading. Outside, the garden bloomed, but I couldn't feel its beauty. My reflection in the glass looked older, more brittle. Not because of age, but because of everything I was holding back. That evening, I stayed downstairs while my husband took a long call upstairs. I paced through the kitchen, touching objects I didn't need, the edge of a glass, the curve of a chair, the cold handle of the refrigerator. And then the doorbell rang. I knew before I opened it. I knew by the shape in the glass. David stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. "I shouldn't have come," he said. "I know," I replied. But I stepped aside anyway. He walked in slowly, as if expecting the floor to fall beneath him. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it was familiar now. We stood facing each other in the hallway, a small distance between us that felt both impossible and too easy to cross. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said quietly. I could feel my heart speeding up, betraying me. "I've tried," he added. I nodded once, slowly. He reached toward me, his fingers just barely brushing mine. The contact sent a jolt through my spine. There was no passion in it, only ache. Only the weight of something we couldn't carry. "We can't," I whispered. "I know." But then, we kissed. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't planned. It was the result of weeks of silence and thoughts unspoken. It happened in a blur, like a breath held too long. The second it ended, we both stepped back, stunned by our own weakness. I covered my mouth, as if that would stop the memory from forming. David looked away, ashamed. "I shouldn't have come," he repeated, then turned and left. I stood in the empty hallway, hands trembling, air thin. The echo of the door closing was louder than it should have been. I stayed there for a long time. When I finally moved, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply walked into the kitchen, took off the bracelet, and placed it in the drawer beneath the scarves. Again. This time, I wasn't sure I'd ever take it out again. I looked at the calendar on the wall. The days ahead felt heavy. Undefined. And yet, part of me knew this was not the end. Not even close. I didn't see David for nearly 2 weeks after that. The space he left behind felt sharper than his presence ever had. I went about my days as if nothing had shifted, but inside, everything was uneven. The bracelet remained buried in the drawer. I refused to wear it again. Every time I opened that drawer, even just to find a scarf or an old pair of gloves, my eyes would catch the glint of its silver curve, and I'd slam it shut a little too quickly. My husband didn't notice. Or if he did, he said nothing. He was always buried in his schedule, in calls, in spreadsheets that meant little to me. But once, during dinner, he looked at me with a strange kind of pause, like something in my face confused him. "You've been quiet," he said, buttering a piece of bread. I gave a small smile, one I'd practiced since childhood. "Just tired." He accepted that, or maybe just didn't want to push. We moved on to safer subjects: the neighbor's garden, the electric bill, a new Italian restaurant that opened downtown. But my thoughts kept circling back to that evening in the hallway. That moment that shouldn't have happened. That moment that did. The longer the silence stretched between me and David, the more the memory took on its own shape, not exaggerated, but weighted. As if it had started to rewrite itself within me. Not in facts, but in feeling. It hadn't just been a kiss. It had been a spark escaping control, an impulse born not of lust, but of need. A silent scream released into the wrong room. And yet, I couldn't stop wondering what he was thinking. Was he regretting it? Trying to forget? Or had he managed to lock it away, neat and sealed, the way men seem to do when something threatens to disrupt their world? I didn't have the same ability. My thoughts had a way of looping endlessly, dragging me into every what if and might have been. One afternoon, I received a message from an old colleague inviting me to a small writers' roundtable in the city. I hesitated, but eventually said yes. It was something I hadn't done in years. The last time I'd gone, David's mother had still been alive. Back then, I was someone entirely different. That Saturday, I drove into town alone. The cafe where the meeting was held sat on a quiet street lined with bookstores and antique shops. It used to be my favorite place, small, with crooked wooden floors and chipped mugs that somehow made the coffee taste better. I hadn't stepped inside since before the wedding. As I pushed the door open, the chime above it rang with the same soft tone I remembered. The warmth hit me immediately, the smell of roasted beans, paper, and something sweet baking in the back. For a few moments, I was just myself again. Not a wife. Not a stepmother. Not a secret keeper. The meeting itself was uneventful. We talked about short fiction, the way characters can surprise you when you let them lead. I didn't share anything, but I listened. I let the voices wash over me like rain through a window I had forgotten how to open. As I gathered my things to leave, a quiet voice behind me said my name. I turned, and there he was. David. He stood near the back counter, hands in the pockets of his coat, eyes unreadable. "I didn't know you'd be here," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden tremor in my chest. He shrugged. "I come here sometimes. Didn't expect to see you." We stood there, the distance between us again thin as air and just as unstable. I looked down, trying to collect myself, then nodded toward the back door. "Walk with me?" He hesitated, then followed. Outside, the alley behind the cafe was quiet, lined with ivy and fire escapes. I leaned against the brick wall, crossing my arms. "I thought you were avoiding me," I said. I was. I appreciated the honesty, even though it stung. And now? He exhaled. I don't know. The pause between us stretched. A bird chirped somewhere far off. A car passed at the end of the block. This can't happen again, I said. Whatever that was. It can't. He nodded. I know. But the way he said it, soft, unsure, made my stomach twist. Then why does it still feel like it might? He didn't answer. I looked at him, really looked. He was still young, yes, but there was something hardened in him lately, something that hadn't been there a year ago. Maybe we were both changing in ways we didn't understand. I never meant for this to happen, I whispered. He stepped a little closer, not enough to touch, but enough to shift the air between us again. I didn't either, he said. But I think about it. More than I want to admit. I pressed my hand to my chest, as if that could keep my heart from climbing higher. I wish we could go back, I said. He nodded once. Me too. We stood like that for another minute, locked in a moment that neither of us dared stretch too far. And then, just like that, he stepped back, turned, and walked down the alley without another word. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. When I returned home that night, my husband was asleep on the couch, glasses tilted on his nose, a book half fallen on his chest. I covered him with a blanket and stood there a long moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just hadn't seen me. And maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all. The days that followed felt disjointed, as if I were living slightly to the left of my own life. Everything was still there for breakfasts, laundry, my husband's voice echoing from his office, but I moved through it all like someone under glass. Detached. Aware. Watching myself perform. David didn't call. I didn't expect him to. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't collapse what fragile distance we'd rebuilt between us. And yet, every time the phone lit up, I checked the name. I resumed the routines that kept the house moving, fresh linens on Mondays, groceries on Wednesdays, flowers on Fridays. I cleaned surfaces that didn't need cleaning. I reorganized drawers that hadn't changed in years. My body was busy while my mind floated elsewhere, back alleys behind cafes, silver bracelets, things unsaid. One morning, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I noticed something strange, a small box on the corner of my nightstand, wrapped in plain brown paper. I hadn't placed it there. It wasn't there the day before. I hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a note, no signature. Asterisk, I understand if you never speak to me again. I just wanted you to have something that wasn't borrowed or found. Something that's only from me. Asterisk. Beneath the paper, a book. One I had mentioned months ago during dinner, in passing, something by an obscure poet I hadn't thought about since. I opened it. No inscription, no date. Just the book. Just a gesture. I put it back in the paper and slid it into the drawer beside the bracelet. Two objects. Both quiet. Both filled with weight. Later that afternoon, my husband came home early. He suggested dinner out, no reason, no celebration, just the two of us, like we used to do in the early months of our marriage. I agreed, surprised by the offer, even more surprised by the tone in his voice. Something gentle. Something trying. At the restaurant, he reached across the table and touched my hand, something he hadn't done in weeks. His eyes searched mine, as if trying to remember what they used to find there. You've seemed far away lately, he said, not accusatory, just observant. I smiled, carefully. Have I? He nodded. I know I haven't been present, not like I should be. I've been thinking about that. I didn't speak. I just waited. I don't want to lose us, he said. The words hung in the air between our wine glasses and folded napkins. We drove home in silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was cautious. Like walking across a bridge that may or may not hold. That night, after he fell asleep beside me, I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional creak of the walls adjusting to the night. I turned to face him in the dark, watched the peaceful rhythm of his breathing. He had never been cruel. He had never lied. He had simply looked away from me for too long. I wasn't sure if it was forgivable. Or if I even wanted it to be. The next morning brought another unexpected moment. David was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. I froze in the doorway. My husband had already left for a meeting. The air was heavy with the smell of coffee, and something else, tension, regret, maybe both. I was just dropping off a book, he said, without looking at me. Didn't expect you to be up. I stepped further into the room, keeping distance. Thank you. For the book. He nodded. A long silence stretched out, filled only by the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the floor beneath us. You don't have to keep giving me things, I said softly. I'm not, he replied. I'm just leaving reminders. That I saw you. That sentence landed hard. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. I had spent so long trying to be invisible in that house. And someone had noticed. The wrong someone. At the wrong time. Or maybe the right time, in the wrong way. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. You make him better, he said. He was never this open. He never looked like he might change. And then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, his words pressing against the inside of my chest like something living. Later that day, I sat on the back porch with my notebook, one I hadn't touched in months. I opened it, not to write, but to look at the blank pages. They felt familiar. Forgiving. Like they might absorb anything I gave them without judgment. I didn't write about David. Or the bracelet. Or the book. I wrote about a woman in a quiet house with ticking clocks and too many windows. A woman who had waited so long to be seen, she forgot how to speak when someone finally looked. That evening, my husband found me asleep on the porch swing, the notebook in my lap. He didn't ask what I had been writing. He didn't need to. He kissed my forehead gently and whispered, "Come inside." And I did. But that night, I dreamed of silver. Of books. Of glances held too long. Of a version of myself I didn't recognize, and wasn't sure I wanted to. It had been a quiet morning, the kind that almost tricks you into thinking everything is fine. The sun filtered gently through the curtains in the kitchen, laying golden stripes across the floor. I moved slowly, making tea, slicing fruit, pretending I didn't notice the silence in the air, or the way it vibrated just beneath my skin. My husband had left early for a conference meeting 2 cities away. He wouldn't be back until late, maybe the next day. He'd kissed me goodbye in the doorway, his touch warm but still light, like a man who's trying to rebuild something he only recently realized was falling apart. I stood at the sink, running water over a bowl of blueberries, when I heard the soft knock on the back door. It was deliberate, controlled, and unmistakably familiar. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. I opened the door slowly. David stood there, hands in his pockets, a faint crease between his eyebrows. His eyes met mine, calm and steady, like he had made a decision before arriving. He didn't ask to come in. I didn't ask why he was there. We sat outside in the shade of the back patio, the air warm and still, the world around us oddly hushed. The garden had begun to change, early signs of summer creeping into the green. The lavender was blooming. For a long time, we didn't speak. There was no need to. The silence between us had become its own language. Finally, he said, "I'm not here to complicate things." I didn't respond. I just watched the way the light played against the curve of the empty glass in his hand. "I just needed to see you once without pretending." Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't know what to say anymore. The words had all twisted inside me. "I can leave," he added. But I didn't ask him to. We sat there, the quiet around us not quite peaceful, but honest. Eventually, I stood, slowly, unsure of my own movements, and stepped closer. He rose too, his expression unreadable. The distance between us, once a careful measure of restraint, dissolved without ceremony. And then, we kissed. There were no fireworks. No dramatic music. Just the soft gravity of two people leaning into a moment they'd tried to resist for far too long. It was quiet. Intimate. Heavy. And then, just as quickly, it ended. We both pulled back, breath catching, eyes avoiding. He stepped away first. "I'm sorry," he said, but not like someone regretting it, more like someone apologizing for how right it had felt. I nodded, unable to speak. I watched him walk toward the side gate, not looking back. Inside, everything felt smaller. I went to the sink, rinsed out the teacup, wiped the counter twice even though it was already clean. My hands moved automatically, like muscle memory. My mind was somewhere else entirely. Later that afternoon, I went into the bedroom and opened the drawer. The bracelet was still there, coiled like a secret. I picked it up, turning it in my fingers. I thought about putting it on. I thought about throwing it away. Instead, I placed it beside the book he had left me. I didn't touch either again for the rest of the day. When my husband called that evening, his voice was cheerful. He told me the meeting went well, that he was staying overnight due to a late dinner with clients. I said all the right things. Asked polite questions. Laughed at a joke I didn't hear. After I hung up, I sat alone in the living room. The sun had set, and the walls took on a kind of hush, like they were listening. I thought about what I had done. Not just today, but in the days and weeks before. The decisions I hadn't made. The ones I had. This wasn't a romance. This wasn't lust. This wasn't about falling into something careless or dramatic. It was something far quieter. And maybe that was what made it so dangerous. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come from deceit, but from need. A need unmet for so long it begins to change shape, first into longing, then into silence, then into something unrecognizable until it's already happened. I had never imagined myself capable of this. And yet, here I was, folding lies into my days like laundry, pressing them into drawers between linen and lace. That night, I slept restlessly, waking every hour to the sound of nothing. My dreams were hazy, shifting. I couldn't remember them when I woke, only the feeling they left behind, tightness in my chest, a kind of breathless guilt. In the morning, the sky was overcast. I opened the windows, letting in the cool breeze, and stood there for a long time, watching the trees sway just slightly in the wind. I wondered how long I could keep walking this thin line without falling. I wondered if I already had. There are mornings that begin like a held breath. You move through them carefully, afraid to shift anything out of place. That was how the day started, a delicate stillness, a fragile silence I didn't want to break. The weather matched my mood, overcast and undecided. I made coffee slowly, letting the rhythm of mundane tasks soothe the unsettled energy still humming through me from the day before. My husband returned mid-morning. He came in quietly, dropped his keys into the ceramic dish by the door, and greeted me with a softness I hadn't expected. There was something in his posture, gentleness, but also effort. as though he was trying to find his way back to something he wasn't sure still existed between us. I met his tone with a warm smile, not forced, but not entirely effortless either. We spent the day together, doing simple things. He suggested a walk through the botanical gardens, a place we hadn't been since the first year of our marriage. I agreed. It felt safe. Public. Light. The gardens were nearly empty. It was a weekday, and the sky remained heavy with clouds. We strolled slowly, pausing at different sections, speaking in a calm rhythm. He pointed out the new glass conservatory, told me how they'd renovated the koi pond near the southeast trail. I listened, nodded, laughed once or twice. It was almost peaceful. Almost. But I felt the weight of the bracelet in my mind even as I left it in the drawer. I felt the memory of David's eyes on me, the way he'd said, "I just needed to see you once without pretending." Those words clung to me like humidity in the air. At one point during the walk, my husband reached for my hand. It surprised me, the sudden warmth of his fingers closing around mine. We walked like that for several minutes, the quiet between us less strained than it had been in months. He was trying. That much was clear. And part of me ached at the timing of it, this surge of care arriving when everything beneath the surface had already shifted. Later that afternoon, back at home, he stepped into his office to take a call, and I found myself wandering. Not aimlessly, but searching for something I couldn't name. My feet brought me to the spare bedroom, the one that used to be David's. It hadn't changed much. The bed was made, tight and untouched. A few books on the shelf. A framed photograph of him and his mother still sat on the desk. I stood in the doorway, looking at the image of the boy he used to be, wondering how many quiet battles he carried after she died. Wondering if I had seen him too late, or just wrongly. In the kitchen, I prepared tea. The same way I always did. But everything about the moment felt layered, present and past colliding in the smallest of actions. As I poured water over the leaves, my phone vibrated on the counter. A message. My heart jumped before I even reached for it. It wasn't David. It was my husband. From the next room. *, join me on the porch when you're done? I missed sitting with you. *. A simple message. Thoughtful. Intentional. I brought the tea out on a tray. He was already seated, wrapped in a light jacket, legs crossed, his phone placed face down beside him. He looked at me in a way he hadn't in a long time, not distracted, not half present, but fully. "Do you ever think about leaving all this behind?" he asked, his voice low, contemplative. I blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, watching the trees sway in the distance, "taking a long trip. Just you and me. Somewhere quiet. Away from everything." I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted that distance. But for opposite reasons. Not escape. Not to mend. But to be somewhere he wasn't. "We could take the train," he continued, "stop at places we've never seen. You used to love train rides." I did. Once. "I'll think about it," I said, wrapping my fingers around the warm mug. And I meant it. That evening, the quiet persisted. Not heavy. Not sharp. Just present. We made dinner together, grilled vegetables, couscous, a simple salad. He opened a bottle of wine and insisted we eat by candlelight, even if it felt cliché. I let him light the wick. I let the evening feel normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. After he fell asleep, I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom for a long time. The house was dark, but not still. It creaked in the way old houses do, like it was keeping its own secrets. I walked downstairs barefoot, into the kitchen, and opened the drawer. The bracelet was still there. The book, too. I didn't take either. I just stared at them. The weight of those objects seemed heavier now that things with my husband were shifting. Was it guilt that made him softer? Or was it something else, intuition? Did he sense the distance, the fracture, the shadow of another name in my silence? I didn't know. I returned to bed just before dawn. He was still asleep, one arm stretched across my side of the bed. I lay beside him, careful not to touch. And in that space between his breath and mine, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit until now. This wasn't a love triangle. It was a quiet disintegration. And I was right in the center of it, holding the matches. The sky was already darkening when I left the house. My husband had fallen asleep early on the couch, his laptop humming quietly beside him, a glass of water untouched on the table. I stood over him for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall with slow, steady rhythm. He looked peaceful, maybe the most peaceful I'd seen him in months. There was something tender in the curve of his arm, the way his hand still loosely held the TV remote like a child who drifted off mid-task. I could have stayed. I could have turned off the lamp, covered him with a blanket, gone upstairs, and let the night pass untouched. But I didn't. I grabbed my coat without making a sound, slipping into the shoes by the back door. The air outside was heavy with moisture, the kind that promised rain but hadn't yet decided to fall. I didn't check my phone. I didn't leave a note. I just walked. The streets were mostly empty, the neighborhood swallowed by quiet. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, as if bowing in slow succession. I passed houses with dim porch lights, closed curtains, slices of life I didn't know and didn't want to. Everything around me felt distant, like scenery in a play I wasn't part of anymore. By the time I reached the old cafe, the one tucked at the edge of the historic district, half forgotten but still alive, it was already glowing with the soft amber light that used to comfort me. I paused before going in, pressing a hand to my chest, feeling the beat of my heart thrum loud and certain against my palm. I stepped inside. David was already there. He sat at a small table in the far corner, just as he had weeks ago, one hand around a warm mug, his eyes watching the door like he'd known I'd come. He didn't smile. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slightly, as if we were picking up a conversation we hadn't finished. I walked toward him, every step slow, deliberate, and sat down without a word. The silence between us was full. Not awkward. Not empty. Just full. He leaned forward slightly. I didn't think you'd actually come. Neither did I. But I said nothing. I let the air settle between us. I've been trying to stay away, he said. I really have. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the table. The wood was old, scratched from years of stories and coffee spills. My fingers traced one of the lines unconsciously. He sighed. But I keep going over that day. In the kitchen. And the porch. And the walk behind the cafe. It's like I can't stop looping it in my head. I looked up then. His face was thinner than before, not in a sick way, just tired. As if holding something heavy for too long had started to show on the outside. I didn't come here for a plan, I said. I didn't come here for anything. I know. We sat there, the noise of the cafe distant, a low hum behind the intensity of the space between us. He glanced at my wrist. You're not wearing it. I didn't need to ask what he meant. No, I said. He nodded again, like that answered more than I had said. I think about what this could have been, he said, voice barely above a whisper. If it had started differently. If life hadn't been so tangled. I looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, I let my guard drop just enough to say what had been pressing against my ribs every night in bed. I don't know how to carry this, I said. Any of it. The guilt. The confusion. The knowing I'll never be able to explain it to anyone without sounding like the villain. He leaned back, resting his head against the wall. Maybe we are villains. I shook my head. No. Just lost. Neither of us spoke after that. We stayed in that corner for what felt like a long time. The cafe slowly emptied, the staff dimming lights, wiping down counters. No one asked us to leave, but we both knew the night was thinning. When I finally stood, he stood too. And then, without hesitation, without build-up, without needing words, we spent the night together. We didn't say goodbye. We didn't say this changes everything. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't romantic. It was inevitable. When I woke the next morning, he was already gone. The space beside me was still warm, the scent of his cologne faint in the air. I sat up slowly, the weight of reality already pressing down as I stared at the hotel room's beige walls, the nondescript furniture, the curtain filtering in an overcast light that felt far too honest. There were no messages on my phone. No missed calls. No questions waiting. I dressed quietly, my body heavy and slow. I didn't check the mirror before leaving. There was no version of me I wanted to look at just yet. Outside, the city looked the same. Cars passed. People rushed to jobs, to school, to breakfast. The world kept moving, indifferent. I walked home without hurry, letting each step sink in. With every block, the weight of what had happened settled deeper, not as regret, but as reality. By the time I reached the front steps of my house, I could hear birds again. I opened the door, stepped inside, and stood there for a moment, listening. The house was empty. And I was someone else. I spent most of the morning pretending nothing had happened. That was the only way I could function, by slipping back into the version of myself that existed before. The version that could fold towels and organize the spice rack without hearing echoes of words I wasn't supposed to have heard, or feeling the shape of someone else's hands long after they were gone. The house was still, too still. I busied myself with anything that offered distraction. I vacuumed the living room even though it didn't need it. I watered plants that had already been watered. I opened every window in the house to let in fresh air, as if the wind could carry away what lingered in the corners of my mind. But the silence kept returning, wrapping itself around me like a thread I couldn't untangle. In the afternoon, my husband returned from the office earlier than usual. His energy was different, lighter, more open. He kissed my cheek, lingered a moment longer than necessary, then pulled back to smile at me in that way I used to love, the way that once felt like home. I thought maybe tonight we could go for a drive, he said. Just the two of us. No plans, no destination. Just go until we feel like stopping. I agreed. I always agree to things when I feel guilty. We left just before sunset. He drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the console. The sky bled into soft orange and gold, the kind of beauty that made everything seem forgivable, even when it wasn't. For the first 30 minutes, we didn't speak. It was a comfortable silence, the kind you can only have with someone who's lived beside you for years. We passed empty fields, roadside diners, a few flickering neon signs, and endless stretches of two-lane roads. Eventually, he spoke. I've been thinking about us, he said. About how distant we've been. And how much of that is my fault. I kept my gaze on the horizon, my throat tightening. I know I haven't always been there, not the way you needed. I thought I was doing the right thing, providing, staying steady, keeping everything running. But somewhere along the way, I stopped really seeing you. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words landing where I wasn't prepared to carry them. "I'm not asking for answers tonight," he continued. "I just want you to know I'm here. Still trying. Even if I've been late to it." I turned toward him slowly, studied the lines on his face, the way the dim light from the dashboard softened his features. He wasn't lying. He wasn't performing. He meant every word. And that was the hardest part. Because I knew what he didn't. Because I had already broken the thing he was now trying to save. We stopped at a quiet overlook just outside the county line. He parked the car facing the valley, the sky now deepening into violet. The town's lights blinked faintly in the distance. We sat in silence, each of us watching the same view, but from entirely different places. He reached for my hand. I let him. His thumb traced lazy circles on the back of my fingers, like he was relearning something he'd once known by heart. I looked down at our hands, tangled together so easily, and felt a wave of something unfamiliar, grief, maybe. Or longing for a version of this moment that didn't carry the weight of everything I'd done. We stayed like that for a while. No questions. No confessions. Just two people trying to hold on to something without knowing how. On the drive home, he hummed along to the radio. I watched the road. The moon followed us the whole way, silent and silver. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, the bracelet still locked away but burning in my memory. Eventually, I wandered into the kitchen. The clock on the wall blinked 2:03 a.m. I opened the drawer. I took out the bracelet. And for the first time in weeks, I held it with both hands, fully letting it exist in the room with me. I didn't put it on. I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding it like a question I didn't know how to ask. A sudden breeze from the open window shifted the curtains, cool air wrapping around my bare arms. I thought about everything that had led to this moment, not just the kiss, or the night in the hotel, but every day before that. Every quiet disappointment. Every small ache I had ignored until it became its own language inside me. And I realized I didn't know what forgiveness looked like anymore. Not his. Not David's. Not even mine. When I returned to bed, my husband stirred in his sleep. He reached out instinctively, his hand finding my waist, pulling me toward him. I let him. And as I lay there in the dark, my back pressed to his chest, I understood that I could no longer pretend this was just about loneliness. It was about the parts of myself I had buried. The woman who had stopped asking for more because she thought silence was safer. The woman who had allowed herself to be forgotten and then punished herself for needing to be remembered. This wasn't a love story. It was a reckoning. And I didn't know how much longer I could live in its aftermath. The days that followed were marked by a silence I no longer trusted. It wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of too much restraint, words swallowed, eyes carefully averted, movements too intentional. My husband continued his efforts, small gestures, kind words, subtle attempts to close a distance he could feel but couldn't name. And I responded with equal politeness, offering smiles that never quite reached my eyes and affection that never sank below the surface. There were moments, of course, when it almost felt real again. Like when he came home with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe I used to love, the one I hadn't visited since the night everything changed. Or when we spent an entire Sunday reorganizing the bookshelves, laughing at the absurd categories we invented, books with sad endings, books we lied about finishing, books with too much dust to be worth it. But none of it reached the core. I felt like I was speaking from another room, like there was a pane of glass between us that neither of us could name, much less break. One evening, he suggested a weekend trip. Just the 2 of us, he said. Somewhere quiet. No schedule. Maybe we'll drive up to the lake. We haven't been in years. I nodded. That sounds nice. And it did. But only in theory. In practice, I felt panic pool somewhere deep in my stomach. The thought of being isolated with him, of pretending for 48 uninterrupted hours, made my skin tighten. Still, I agreed. Because saying no would raise questions. And I wasn't ready for those questions. I wasn't sure I'd survive them. The night before we were supposed to leave, I found myself unable to sleep. Again. I wandered downstairs, not out of restlessness, but out of habit now. The kitchen had become my sanctuary in the late hours. A place where the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaks of the floorboards kept me tethered to something ordinary. I sat at the table with a cup of lukewarm tea, staring out the window into the darkness. The yard was still, the garden shadowed and silent. I thought about the version of myself who had once loved this house. Who had painted the kitchen walls while humming under her breath. Who had planted basil in mismatched ceramic pots and cried when the first one died because she took it as a sign of her own failure. I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't sure I could be her again. At some point, I must have drifted off in the chair. I woke to the sound of footsteps above me, my husband getting ready for work. Morning light bled slowly through the window, soft and gray. I went upstairs, slipped quietly back into bed before he came to kiss my forehead. "Get some rest," he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "We'll leave early tomorrow." I nodded, eyes still half closed. "Okay." When he left the house, I stayed in bed for a long time, unmoving. Not thinking. Just breathing. It was the only thing I knew how to do without effort anymore. That afternoon, while folding clothes for the trip, I found something in the pocket of one of my coats, a crumpled note, written in handwriting I knew instantly. Asterisk, I never wanted to be your mistake. Asterisk. Just that. Nothing else. No signature. No date. My knees buckled slightly, and I sat down hard on the edge of the bed. I hadn't seen David since the night we spent together. Not once. No calls. No texts. Not even a glance across a room. It was like he had disappeared, or like the world had reshuffled itself to keep us apart. But this note, it hadn't been here before. Which meant he had come into the house. At some point. While I was gone. Or sleeping. Or unaware. The realization was a cold bloom inside my chest. I didn't feel fear. Not exactly. But I felt something that lived adjacent to it, discomfort, maybe. Or grief. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into the drawer beside the bracelet and the book. The drawer that now held more weight than most rooms. Later that evening, I went for a walk. I needed air. I needed space. I needed something that wasn't steeped in the noise of my own mind. The sky was turning dusky, streaked with the kind of colors that make everything look softer than it really is. I walked without direction, letting my feet decide for me. I passed the elementary school, the park with the rusted swing set, the corner store where I used to buy lemon candies just because I liked the way they made my mouth hurt a little. Eventually, I found myself near the house David used to rent. The porch light was off. Curtains drawn. No sign of movement. I stood across the street, not daring to go closer, but unable to walk away just yet. There was no closure waiting here. No final conversation. No confrontation. Just silence. And silence, I was learning, could be the loudest thing of all. When I returned home, my husband was sitting at the dining room table with a travel book open, pen in hand. He looked up as I entered. "I was thinking we could stop at that old bookstore on the way up," he said. "You used to love their poetry section." I nodded, offering a small smile. "That sounds perfect." And it did. It sounded safe. Familiar. Harmless. But as I packed my overnight bag that night, I realized something. I didn't know who I was packing for. Not really. Not the woman I had been. Not the wife I was pretending to be. Not the woman David had seen in quiet corners. Someone else entirely. And I had no idea what she would do next. We left early, just after sunrise. The road was quiet, the sky still soft with the blue of early morning. My husband drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the armrest, his thumb occasionally tapping in rhythm with the music playing faintly through the speakers. A gentle playlist, instrumental, familiar. Something we'd listened to on a trip years ago, before everything grew complicated. I watched the trees rush by in a blur of green and gold, my thoughts drifting, unanchored. The bag beside me felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in implication. Packed not just with clothes, but with contradictions. The note from David still rested in my wallet, tucked behind a forgotten receipt for toothpaste and apples. I hadn't been able to throw it away. We stopped for coffee in a small town off the highway. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Mismatched chairs, chipped mugs, a handwritten menu above the counter. I sat at a table by the window while he ordered. A part of me wanted to say something, anything, that might pull us out of this fog we'd both been navigating in silence. But the words felt like they belonged to someone else. When he returned with 2 steaming cups, he smiled. Still prefer oat milk? I nodded. Always. We sat there sipping, the warmth of the drink a small comfort. A child ran past the window, laughing, chased by a dog on a red leash. The moment passed like wind. Back on the road, he reached over and placed his hand gently on mine. I didn't pull away. But I didn't close my fingers around his either. By late morning, we reached the lake. The same one we'd visited during our first year together. The same wooden cabin still stood at the edge of the shore, though now it looked smaller, like a memory shrunk by time. He'd reserved the place for the weekend, surprise, he said. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old fabric. 2 windows faced the water. The kitchen was small. The bed neatly made. Everything simple. Clean. Timeless. He unpacked while I wandered to the porch, letting the screen door slap shut behind me. The lake stretched wide and still, barely rippling in the breeze. The air smelled like pine and wet stone. I stood there with my arms folded, the morning sun warming my skin. When he came out, he wrapped his arms gently around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. I missed this, he said softly. Us. I nodded, but said nothing. That night, we made dinner together, grilled vegetables, pasta, a bottle of wine. We ate on the porch under a sky slowly peppered with stars. He talked more than usual, telling stories from work, old memories, things he said he hadn't thought about in years. I listened, responding when I could. Smiling when it seemed appropriate. Later, when we went to bed, he reached for me. His touch was careful. Familiar. But something inside me pulled back, even as I moved closer. I let him hold me. I let him think I was still there. But I wasn't. My body was present. My voice, my breath, my warmth, all of it available. But something in my core had drifted. Not in anger. Not even in guilt. But in absence. Quiet, final. The next morning, I woke early. He was still asleep, one arm draped across the pillow where I had been. I dressed quietly, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and walked down to the water. The sky was soft with fog, the lake barely a mirror. I stepped to the edge and stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through my shoes. In my hand, I held the bracelet. The one he had found in his car and given to me. The one that wasn't his to give. The one that had become the symbol of everything I had buried beneath politeness, beneath duty, beneath silence. I opened my hand and let it drop into the water. There was no sound. No splash. Just the soft impression of metal slipping into depths that wouldn't return it. When I came back to the cabin, he was in the kitchen making coffee. He turned when he heard the door open. "Where'd you go?" "Just down to the water," I said. "It's quiet out there." He smiled. "Peaceful, right?" I nodded. "Yes. Peaceful." We drove back in the afternoon. He sang along to the radio once, off-key and unaware. I looked out the window, letting his voice become part of the background noise. That evening, after unpacking, I sat in the living room alone. He was upstairs, on a call. The house looked the same. But something in me had changed. I stood and went to the drawer. The book was still there. The note. But the bracelet was gone. For good. I closed the drawer carefully. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. Not closure. Not relief. But stillness. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I couldn't go back to the way things had been. Not because of what I had done. But because of what I had finally let go.